I think we can, yeah.
Right, I would like to say this is going to be a great session. As I said, Rural Mobility as a Service. We've got 3 great speakers internationally. Again, thank you very much to these guys for getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, or it's 9 o'clock at night in some cases. We will have, as I said, Japan, America, Australia and Scotland. For those of you that don't know Mobility as a Service, the best person to introduce that is Ali McEnroy. So Ali, MaaS Scotland hat, Technology Scotland hat, take it away.
Yeah, I question the best person part of that, but yeah, I'm more than happy to do so. Yeah, really enjoyed this morning's session, but I am particularly excited about this one because it is in an area that is of particular interest to us as Technology Scotland and the MaaS Scotland network that we run beneath that. So yeah, so we're going to be talking about integration of transport really, and a move towards more dynamic, flexible, personalised services, and how that can support, in particular, of course, rural mobility, and we'll be doing so through various international perspectives. Just before I kick off with our first speaker, though, I just wanted to briefly highlight something that's happening in Scotland at the moment. So, about a year ago, the Scottish Government announced the creation of its MaaS investment fund, something that we've been asking for over a period of a couple of years. And that is now supporting 3 projects, one of which we'll hear more specifically about very soon. But the reason I think it might be of interest to this particular group is that the project is there, the programme, sorry, is there to support demonstration and piloting of MaaS across various different thematic areas. And one of those that was included in round 1 of the fund and will also be included in round 2 is that of rural connectivity. So Scottish Government recognise the role that MaaS could play here and are very keen to see how that demonstrated in a Scottish context, and indeed at least a couple of the initial projects have quite a significant rural element to them, if you like. So I will be posting a couple of things in the chat just to sort of direct you towards the fund and ourselves at MaaS Scotland. But one of the things we've done is clearly in this current world, networking and collaborating in advance of a fund is pretty difficult. That's why events like this are so important, and why we're so happy to be supporting it. But we have also created what we're calling an online hub, and that is an opportunity for people to come together. Jenny mentioned the sheer number of stakeholders often involved in delivery of these projects, to come together to discuss ideas, to discuss projects, and just generally to make connections. So I'll also be putting that in the chat. So if MaaS is of interest, or is of interest by the end of this session, which I hope it will be, then please do log on to that and see what other people are doing and how you might be able to get involved. Someone who knows a lot about the MaaS Investment Fund is our first speaker, who is Steve Cassidy. He's the director and co-founder at Fuse Mobility, who are one of the lead partners on one of the first projects funded through the MaaS Investment Fund. And he's going to be talking about that and much else besides. So Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, yeah, my name's Steve Cassidy. I hope you can all see that slide. I am going to be doing a number of things. I'm going to talk about 2 projects, 1 fail, 3 lessons, and 8 words. And also, I'll be including a few pictures from a rural village that I spend a lot of time in. And this first one is the Christmas Carol concert that happened in the bus shelter. So let's start with some of these things. 2 projects. First project, I just want to mention Navigogo. Navigogo was a project that was implemented. It was part funded by Innovate UK. And it was to design a mobility as a service implementation. Actually, it wasn't. I'm going to go back. It was designed to help young people not feel as if they had to own a car, and it was focused on an urban area and a rural area. And what they designed this service, and it was what they designed was mobility as a service. They didn't want a game, which we thought they might want, or something else like that. They just wanted everything in one place and to be simple. So we developed something called Navigogo, which was the brand, and there's some people in the call, Carla and Martin, who are involved in this project. And the service itself was a web app, and it brought together lots of information so people could get personalized travel plans, and they could plan things, they could book the travel, they could get rewards from Young Scott, who was one of the main partners, and they recruited people to be part of it. And it was a success in so many ways. We had 100 people on there, we had 2,000 trips, 500 were paid for through a stored account balance, which is basically a purse. There was lots of reported increase in confidence. 43% of people changed the travel. It was all good stuff. And one of the other successes, the good stuff, was that we took that platform out to create Fuse, and we've implemented another number of services for older people, people with dementia, etc. But if you look at this operating area, Dundee, sort of medium-sized city, and we also included North East Fife, which is predominantly rural, which takes us on to our fail. So some good stuff from Navigogo, learnt a lot, but we failed in the rural area, we would say. Why did we fail? One of the reasons we went there was because we wanted to test ourselves and test the approach, but we also wanted to try and integrate services there because there was a regional ticket, which we thought could be useful. But we failed for a number of reasons. First one, the number of users that we had, and they were very dispersed. We didn't manage to promote and recruit enough users. It became very focused on the urban area. It was very easy to get that through Young Scott, get their members in the urban areas, and that caused a problem. They were very, very dispersed, and we didn't really feel as if we connected to them. The second thing was that the major operators, to get the major operators integrated, it was in the too hard box, really. We didn't have enough time. We couldn't integrate with all of their ticketing systems. And that included demand responsive transport as well. So there's a nice DRT service in North East Fife, which at the time was run by someone called Moffat and Williamson. And they, for us to integrate the service with them so people could plan, book and pay on the actual service, it took too much time, and there was reluctance, and it was hard. And so it was in a too hard box. So we've got 25 users in that too hard box, the integration. And then we were just distracted, I think, being very honest. We had so many users in the urban area who had so many specific needs, and were using shared bike schemes, etc., and the buses. We just got focused on that area. And we always said, and I'll come back to this later, we always said that there'd be a cross-subsidy model, that we felt that the greater number of users in the urban area and the incomes that generated would cross-subsidize the rural, and we never got to that state. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the things that I should say is that we, the mobile connectivity, which is patchy in North East Fife, that was never really a problem for us. And when we talked to the rural users, we made sure that people could download PDF journey plans, and a lot of the information that was planned and booked was in advance at home. So that was less of an issue. I know that can be an issue, but it was less of an issue in this particular trial. But I must say that it was a rural fail. There's some of the reasons. Oh, I should go back to why there's that picture of some urinals, I suppose, as well. So that's a picture from a journey that I did to my rural village. When I got off the train at a local town, waiting to get the bus, I was busting for a pee. So I found through Google Maps the toilet. What Google Maps didn't tell me was that you had to pay, and I didn't have any cash. So I had to go to Smith's. And go and get some money and come back and give the attendant 50p so I could go to the toilet. One of the things that we have done, and the most popular thing when we do our co-design on mobility services, integrating toilets, telling people where they are and if they have to pay and how they pay. So the 3 lessons from our rural fail, and I'll illustrate these in the next project. Activation, getting the services started, getting the critical mass, that's key. Secondly, connectivity, but connectivity to people, it links to activation, and simple technology, keeping it simple. And the other one was the model and governance. And the next project I'll tell you about is the Transport Scotland Mobility Investment Fund project, where we're trying to apply some of these lessons. The picture there on the same journey, I'd been to the toilet, I then went to the bus, and they had a very nice contactless reader on the bus that you can see at the bottom right. So I went with my contactless card to pay, and I was told by the bus driver, oh, that won't work, mate. It very rarely works. There's no connectivity here, I'm afraid. So you've got to pay by cash. I said, do people get upset if they don't have cash? He said, yes, they do, because they've got to go and get some cash, and there's not another bus for 2 hours. So I could understand that. I also didn't understand how the operation worked. You have to press the little red button at the top to stop on this minibus, and I didn't know that. And people were doing that. It was demand responsive. It was hailed by individuals. So again, one of the things that we do in all of our services is make sure that people just know how services work, because that's a huge barrier. So applying those lessons to this current project, the second project, Project Enable, we've implemented a MaaS platform throughout the whole of the region, through Stirlingshire through to Angus, and there are 3 services on top of that. The idea here is that there's that middle layer of planning, booking, paying. This is the platform that's available. We've integrated at the bottom all of those transport services. But on the top, there are 3 particular services. One is an NHS app to get people to hospital in Perth Royal Infirmary. The other one is a Lomond app for the National Park. The other one is for a college. And the idea there is that, and this is important in terms of the lesson learned, the NHS, Lomond, Dundee and Angus, they bring their users, and it's designed around their users. So it's not the Navigogo brand, it's their brand. And that's really important. And they can achieve their objectives by exploiting that platform. That's very key. And in terms of that booking and payment, we've now gone to very simple. We just basically integrate as well as we can. So we can do some contactless, very simple contactless payments on buses, but also with community transport, which is integrated. And so we can tell people that's available to people if they meet the criteria. We can just give a telephone number if we got to. And I think one thing I would say is that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, which is one of the things we learned. And the final thing I would say on this is the model. So the model and the lessons learned is, okay, we are as Fuse, we are providing as a B2B now, not as B2C, a B2B platform to the public sector. That's owned by TACTRAN, and there are 3 services on there. There's governance around that, which is the local authorities in the area and the service providers. That's key. The work that we're doing is very much about finding out where gaps of transport are and putting new services on there. And so finding out from the data where the gaps are and making a case for putting those services upon the platform. And that can be, it could be in Angus, for example, the hub, so we should have a conversation. But if you want a service on top, that can be done. The key thing is any money that's generated. The money that's generated, and there are some cross subsidies that can happen, that goes into the platform, it goes into the governance, so that when those new blobs emerge, you can determine whether or not that it can be afforded, whether or not we can build that service out. And so there's got to be that decision making and the income streams that often go out of the transport system to investors, but they're going to be staying locally within the public sector. And we're developing a toolkit to allow those local communities or service providers, the new blobs, the new services, to basically come onto the platform in an easy way. And I'm really taken by, yesterday, Jenny mentioned something about community readiness levels as opposed to technology readiness levels. I think that's key. I really liked that. Finally, I would say, one of the things that we have learned, this is more of a reflection, is that there are assets available in the community. This is our village shop where there is a post office for part of the time. The notice board is fantastic. It's got lots of information about demand responsive transport, but you've got to pick up your phone and then ring. One of the things we like to do is just uncover these assets. Yes, create a technological asset like we're doing in the TACTRAN region, but also uncover the community assets that are available. And that's what those blobs, those new services can be. Wherever there is a need, whatever that looks like, it could be a community, it could be a school, it could be a college, it could be a health centre. They are the new services. My final things in my final 10 seconds is my 8 words. Something that we've learned already, and Renee mentioned this, is those services on top of the platform, someone has to own it, someone needs to be bought in, it has to integrate simply, and you have to have a model for doing stuff, going to the communities that are ready or helping them get ready and trying something and seeing if it works. And that's the model that we've got in the TACTRAN region, which we have been working on quite hard for the last few months during COVID, and we're pretty much ready to launch. Thanks for that. So I will now go all the way from the urinals at Pitlochry to Azarel in Japan. I'll stop sharing my screen to enable that. Azarel.
Yeah, so we are now flying to Japan, to the opposite side of the world, to talk about the rural mobility in the land of the rising mass. And Japan is the reason we're talking about Japan is because Japan is one of the players that is sealing in that precisely thing. But before that, let me explain about myself. So I'm Asrael from Cities Forum, an international NPO that we foster international collaboration on mobility and sustainable solutions. So before that, normally, it's working, it's not working, it's working now. So normally when we have this image of a Japan being Tokyo, represented by Tokyo City with almost 50 million people and a very urbanized area, and truly this is Japan. But in fact, Japan is also a different country. We have different islands. Many of these islands have very hundreds, sometimes thousands of people living on them. But there's also a countryside in a mountainous country where it's facing a lot of issues regarding mobility. And this is a very different thing from the West. But there's another more thing, and is that different to the West, when we talk about rural areas in Japan, we need to think about what is considered rural here, because in Japan, a city with almost 500,000 people can be perfectly considered rural, depending on how this is set up. So what are the major keys to driving this mobility interest in Japan regarding rural areas? So the first one is obvious, is the depopulation of the country. So the country is losing population. And since 10 years ago, the population is on the decrease, and there's nothing that seems that is telling us that this is going to change for now. And there's another key issue, which is in rural areas, particularly, this is a very important one. But more importantly, the people who are remaining are actually getting old. Japan is the country with the highest longevity in the world. And this, at the moment, almost a third of the population is above 65 years old. So this actually requires some to cater some specific mobility needs and specific mobility solutions for those people. And there are two more important things for rural areas. And one is the economic prospectus, which is not very, well, it's not very good, obviously, because all these issues. But ideally, we want mobility, I mean, as a support of the economic revitalization of these areas. But there is one more, and this one is very unique to Japan, and is natural disasters. And natural disasters, such as the typhoon that is coming tomorrow, landing on the country, by the way, are quite often happening in rural areas, impacting these areas harder than cities, who are obviously more prepared. So we want to see how mobility can actually address the necessity of transportation during those periods. So what kind of solutions is the Japanese environment thinking about? So I just took a couple of most important solutions, but this is not extensive list. So mostly they are considering on-demand transport as a replacement for some public transport is no longer profitable, because in Japan, historically, public transport has been actually a profitable industry. And they are considering on-demand transport in these kind of rural areas where they can provide more tailored solutions and more cost-effective ones. There's one which is green and slow mobility, which is basically what everyone calls the golf cart. So they are electric vehicles, they're with low capacity and low speed. They are matching and they are targeting mostly old people in rural areas. And they are also support as, for example, inbound tourism, and a way to have a more sustainable solutions than just having everyone with their own cars. Now, there is a touristic MaaS, and this is a very unique thing to Japan, which I will come back later. But this is a key support for creating revenue in local areas and revitalize their economics, while providing new sources of revenues for public transport authorities that they can use to improve their services in these rural areas. Now, we talk about on-demand transport, but there's also autonomous vehicles. And why autonomous vehicles are a very important thing in Japan, and why they're investing a huge amount of resources in that, is because population is decreasing, and in many areas at the moment, they cannot hire any bus driver or any taxi driver because there's no enough manpower for that. And finally, air mobility is a big thing also incoming in the following years, and probably in the following decades, particularly when it comes to logistics and to reach out to rural areas that they are very isolated from the main cities, but also during natural disasters to provide relief supplies and so on. So the government of Japan, 4 years ago, they create this Society 5.0 idea, where the physical layer, so the infrastructure, vehicles, and so on, can match together with a virtual layer of information. And there has been a lot of policy developments and a lot of public support on these things. So I just took some relevant items from there, but the list is actually far longer than that. So since 2018, the government of Japan already developed a roadmap to realize air transport and autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles. And last year, there was the confirmation of the New Mobility Services Working Group, where the conclusion of this group, that eventually evolved in what is called Smart Mobility Challenge, were a publicly funded initiative where the government will provide funding to test new services and new business models and new technologies of mobility, not only in rural, but also urban. And from there was already a first batch of projects that were finished, and now we're in the second one. And from those projects, we learn many new things that we compile in new policy frameworks, for example, for having standardized guidelines for cooperating on MaaS data, and also smart city architecture. So going to the Smart Mobility Challenge. So the Smart Mobility Challenge, there were two batches, one in 2019 that was already finished, and one in 2020, which is ongoing. And it might be, some of the projects might get delayed because of COVID, but so far, an important thing of the Smart Mobility Challenge is that the majority of projects has been related to rural areas or tourist related projects, which normally are in rural areas. Now, an important difference from this, the way the Smart Mobility Challenge is conceived, is that this is a public-private consortium made out of different private stakeholders, as well as academia, government, and so on. And they try to find this consensus regarding what kind of projects are actually succeeding more, what kind of solutions are required, and so on. And more importantly, these projects, when they are submitted, they are normally standardized. They need to be evaluated, and they need to provide some feedback in order to develop some new policies or new real projects. Now, a very important thing is that most of the projects were actually continuing from the first batch, which is actually good. And we will see them again in the second batch. Normally we test different things. For example, a very well-known project in the first batch, Izuko, was to test some convergence of transport in a rural area to provide tourism, inbound tourism. And the second one was more thinking about what kind of technologies or freight solutions was actually providing that. But importantly, I think that all these initiatives that is consistently done by the central government has some common structure and is meant to lead to that standardized MaaS framework. So just for your notice, this map that I can happily provide in the link is also including not only the Smart Mobility Challenge, but also different trials all over the country. So as you can see, rural areas have, many of these trials has been done in rural areas. Now, I would like to talk to a very different approach from Japan, and is the mobility as a service. So a very interesting thing from Japan is that many of these trials and many of the initiatives do not focus on the transport part. They focus on the service, on the economic activities. So if we understand transport as just as a mean to do something, I mean to reach out some healthcare or to fulfill our needs or to satisfy our necessities, then we can actually think about why people is moving, how can we support that, and how can we create seamless approaches to that. And there has been, for example, on-demand trials where hospital appointments were already linked to on-demand services. So as soon as, for example, an old person arrived to the hospital or finish the hospital at their given time, some people that finish at the same time may get a dedicated vehicle that they can reach them out to their houses. So this is a way to provide this seamless mobility to people in need. But for example, there has been some mixtures between logistics and passenger transportation. For example, in the north of Hokkaido, a company called MaaS Japan try on the autonomous vehicles, mixing supermarket groceries with some passengers transport. But for example, in this picture, this is from Tango Railways, which is a railway company that just failed, and it was sold out to an IT company that owns buses, and they reflowed the whole line, and now it's actually a very successful case of rural MaaS. They also try to provide to farmers with basic logistics, because farmers in rural areas do not have enough manpower to dedicate to the transport groceries. And another one, which is very important, is the community development. So this is also for Tango Railway. So this is a cafe in a station in a rural area that was actually crowdfunded by the local community as an initiative from this railway. So the idea is that this railway brings some tourists to this area in order to revitalize that. And thanks to this, this cafe is a hub for those tourists to spend some time, of course, spend some money. And those kind of incomes are actually supporting the railway operator that is providing normal services to the locals ones. So these kind of like combinations and put focus on the service rather than the mobility is something we have seen here, particularly with the railway companies. So that's basically all my presentation regarding transportation in Japan. I think that the key points here are particularly how the government is clearly pushing forward a common growth for developing MaaS, and how particular new streams of revenue are creating this kind of rural MaaS in a more sustainable way. So now I would like to go to the South Hemisphere, and I would like to introduce my colleague Bruno from Australia, who is going to talk about isolated communities and rural mobility. So Bruno, please share your screen.
Thanks, Azael. Awesome presentation too. I don't know if my background is working. There's a bit of issues with the background. Sorry about that. So it might...
You look funky and you look like you're discoing. So if people can cope with it, otherwise you can switch it off.
All right, that's cool. And I share my screen. All right, terrific. Does that work?
Yep, it's working.
Awesome. Yeah, so welcome to Australia. I guess we'll go a little bit to the extreme of the rural areas in the world and what we call, remoteness in some ways. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, on which I am today, the Djadjawurrung people, and also to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So a little journey to a very remote part of the world, and it's as a geographic entity, it's actually quite hard to really grasp the diversity of what is remoteness in Australia. And to give you a bit of background, I was a research manager of a project called Transport Futures that was undertaken in partnership with the Center for the Cooperative Research Center for Remote Economic Participation and the Center for Appropriate Technology. It was funded by the federal government. We're based in Alice Springs, right in the middle of Australia. And it was a 4-year project that aimed at investigating sustainable and accessible transport system improvements for very remote communities in Australia and all around Australia. So a bit of a blank canvas, it was a fabulous journey, really a fantastic opportunity to really understand and unpack some of the issues that remote Australians were facing in terms of transport and mobility. A little snapshot of what remote Australia is, and I think I touched base on that. It's a very diverse type of geographical context that is sort of encapsulated in the remoteness context. We do have a definition in Australia. There's a accessibility and remoteness indicator of Australia, the ARIA Plus index. And that index is distance-based. Actually, as part of the studies that we conducted, we recommended to benchmark this index from a distance-based algorithm to a travel time-based algorithm, and to include some digital access in the algorithm as well. But you can see that, where we're talking about a 20-minute neighborhood in urban Australia as well. In remote Australia, it's much more kind of a 150 kilometer plus neighborhood that is more relevant. And something that is quite exceptional in Australia, in remote Australia, is that there are about 1,200 very remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. There's also about 40,000 small and medium enterprises. There are many places of really high international environmental significance. And it also accommodates about 60% of the nation's mining platform, which is the first resource export in Australia. And yeah, another thing that is quite interesting, and I think there are some parallels with what Azarel was drawing for Japan, you can see that in terms of population, there's in remote Australia, about half of the population is composed of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. At a national level, that the same population group represents about 3% of the population. So about roughly 800,000 people out of 24 million. While in a very remote context, it's about 160,000 out of 320,000 people. So there's a very strong representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And also, which is a common characteristic of many very remote areas around the world. And a strong identity, you know, from that sense, derives from that characteristic. And also the population is will be tripling. The population aged over 65 will be tripling by 2050. So there's a very yes, this is a substantial population aging factor to take into consideration. Also, as Arel touched based on for Japan, remote Australia is also characterized by very extreme climates. So I think most of you would be aware of the catastrophic bushfires that affected the southeastern part of the country last year. And that's something that is quite common in many places around remote Australia. One thing that is quite, you know, that through our research we uncovered was the fact that on a typical year, people living in very remote communities will be cut out of the rest of the world at least 4 times for more than a week because of extreme weather. And about 27% of people in Central Australia, in some of the surveys we conducted, reported to experience really significant difficulties associated with extreme weather that were restricting their mobility. And on top of that, you know, in the context of, I guess, you know, global warming, yeah, the extreme events and actually the intensity of extreme events is increasing as well. When we speak about also transport networks in remote Australia, we speak about like a very different type of transport networks in many other countries. Most often, actually, we're looking at roads that are unsealed, that are very vulnerable, not necessarily well maintained, and about half of the population that we surveyed, and we surveyed around 750 people in 50 different communities around remote Australia, reported to experience difficulties because of poor road conditions. And that's a huge contrast when you look at the needs, the mobility needs that people have. So for instance, you know, like in Central Australian communities, people travel an average of 45,000 kilometers per year. And that's about 3 times more than the national average, which is fascinating, you know, like, and that's actually to go sometimes to the next service center for a medical appointment, yeah, for basically undertaking some shopping activities, for work purposes, for education purposes, and so on. And really, you can feel that transport has a central role in terms of sustaining livelihoods in remote communities. To the point that, you know, like it's very much something that is essential for or considered as an essential services, as an essential service in many, yeah, many aspects. What is quite confronting is to see the fact that when we talk about remote Australian transport systems, we really speak about a 2-speed system. So about 90% of the vehicles used for service delivery in remote Australia are 4-wheel drive vehicles. And that contrasts radically with the fact that about 5% or less of people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander actually have access to a form of 4-wheel drive vehicle in remote communities, which is, yeah, very confronting in terms of, I guess, systemic inequalities. And to give you a bit of another figure, there's about 1 vehicle that is registered and roadworthy for 12 people in very remote communities. So really, we're talking about a very strong level of disadvantage for people living in very remote communities. Fuel prices, petrol prices about 80% higher, and transport cost as well. And that means that a lot of people, you know, are very vulnerable. We have some, yeah, like I guess minority groups within the minority are more vulnerable. One thing that is quite remarkable also is that about half of the communities don't have access to any form of public transport. The flip side is that about 50% do have access. So it's a little bit like the glass half full, glass half empty. But there's some very well documented impact on economic participation levels that can be attributed to a restricted level of transport access. And yeah, now we're gonna speak about the transport, like an innovative type of transport service in Central Australia, the Central Bush Bus. I'm gonna try to share a website. Just a second. Hopefully that's gonna work.
If it doesn't work, don't worry, Bruno. We're running out of time.
Okay. All right. I'm hopeful that this is.
We can share the link in the chat.
Oh, okay. It's very quick. Hopefully.
Go for it.
Okay. I don't know. I go back to the presentation, and
yeah, we'll share the chat. We'll share it in the chat, and people can have a look at it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
And go back there. I just have 2 more slides, not even. Okay. One particular and specific characteristic of the Centre Bush Bus is the fact that basically it's a private company. It doesn't have any subsidy. It supplies about 35 very remote communities, and there's about 50,000 passengers per year. The services are door to door. It does provide passenger services as well as delivery services. So it's a kind of a mixed type of transport business model. And also there's some automated payments. It's quite innovative actually. It's from a tablet. So even people who don't have necessary access to a phone can access the service. And the only thing that they have to do is to register their bank account. And it's not even the bank account, it's their wealth payment account into the tablet system. And it's basically taking the money at the source with the agreement, obviously. So it's a very innovative and something that is a low-cost technology that works formidably well. And it undertakes about 2 trips per week, and the average cost is about $400 for a return trip. Yeah, so in terms of future opportunities, you know, we're looking at community transport integration in a mobility as a service context with different types of ecosystems that would be user-friendly, like going a little bit above and beyond in terms of freight tendering and integrating freight and passenger services. And down the track, also looking at driverless and automated electric or fuel cell vehicles that would be potentially renewable energy powered. Thank you very much. And now over to Dwight in the US.
Not quite, Bruno. I'll just, we'll bring in Dwight in just a little second. Thank you for that, though. I think, I mean, we thought we had rural areas, eh? Wow, that is a different scale. Thank you to all of our speakers in that session. It's one of the great things about these online events is that you get that opportunity for that broad international perspective. And I think it's interesting that the scales that we're dealing with might be completely different, but often the challenges actually are very similar. And I think that came through really clearly there. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. Jenny will keep me right on that. And as Bruno kind of alluded to, I'd like to bring in Dwight Mengel, who's the Chief Transportation Officer at Tompkins County, Ithaca, New York. So Dwight will be joining the panel session. Thank you for all the questions that have come through so far. Just before we crack on to them, I just want to highlight a couple of other things that have come through the chat. Carla has put up an Innovate UK opportunity that might be of interest to a number of you on the call, so please do check that out. And I noticed also that Marion has put up the Como UK's Mobility Hub guidance as well. For those of you that were at the earlier session, I'm sure that will be of interest. So we'll get cracking with one of the first questions, and it's one that I think is really important, and it's a question almost in the form of an accusation, and I think rightly so. And it's one that's thrown often at proponents of MaaS, such as myself and others, which is that we must not forget those who struggle to access digital solutions, be that from a connectivity perspective, a cost perspective maybe, an accessibility perspective. So I'd quite like to get everybody's sort of views on this, but Steve, you went first, so I'll come to you first. And I know this is an area that you've done a lot of in terms of user engagement and things, but in terms of your own projects, how have you tried to negotiate what is quite a difficult challenge?
Yeah, I think all of it starts with, we've got, a base platform which does pretty boring transport technical stuff. But we also spend a lot of time thinking what the touch point should be. We're definitely not saying to everybody use an app. As part of the Enable project, I spent 3 days in the waiting room at a urology department in Perth Royal Infirmary talking to people, predominantly older men, who didn't really use the internet very much. We were thinking, how do we connect to these people? We basically talk to people, find out how they access services, think about how that service, and Azrael, I think, summed it up, he talks a lot about services. These are services, these aren't apps or transport solutions, these are services. And, is there going to be a phone backup? Is the printed material? But talk to people. The work that we did a couple of years ago with Life Changes Trust, dementia charities design mobility as a service for people living with dementia. Actually the interface was something. It was a website, and it was available for people to use with carers or friends, to be able to help them think about how they give up the car, because that's what was important to them. So it's where you deliver value, it's talking to people, it's thinking about what works for them. And yeah, I mean, that's what we do, and things come out from that. And I must say that the stuff that we're doing in Enable, there's websites, there's a widget, there's an app, but there's also lots of printed material as well. So, yeah.
Brilliant, Steve. I'd like to bring Dwight in now, if I may, because Dwight, I know you've been doing a lot in this space in New York. So I wonder if you could maybe just give us a very brief introduction, and then talk a little bit about what you're doing from that accessibility standpoint. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We are doing our MaaS program is in two phases, and the first phase is a call center and app that would function 24/7, and this covers a small urban and a rural county of 100,000 people total. The second thing, though, is a greatly expanded customer support program, and that is what I just want to talk about briefly. We know there are many people who have trip failures every day, and we hear about the ones where a patient at a doctor's office is abandoned by the taxi service. And although the taxi promises to pick them up and take them 30 miles, the taxi never comes and the doctor's office closed. And that person's just confronted with not having service. That's one example of a trip failure. And I will just say, in that case, I know that one of the other patients volunteered to take that person home. There are people who they absolutely need to get to their job very early in the morning when public transport is not working from the rural coming into the urban area. And so they are carpooling. And their carpool buddy sometimes things don't work out. And they have to gauge on whether or not they are going to pay to have a taxi come and pick them up, where they can get to work on time. And if they don't get to work on time, they are fired. And the cost of that taxi trip just to get to work costs them 4 hours of labor of that day. So there's all these opportunities where there are trip failures, and we will pilot a program to mitigate those trip failures. If you ask me what are the details, well, I'll tell you that in 3 months. But we are among, I think, the first to recognize that things like this are a regular occurrence of life. And it's, if you're going to offer a MaaS program, I think you should deal with it up front and work to really make it happen.
Perfect, thanks, Dwight. And I think it's an important question. So if I might just ask Azro, Bruno, do you have any comments on this brief, if we could, on this kind of, I guess, inclusivity angle, and whether you've had direct experience yourselves?
So in fact, in Japan, they launched something called Universal MaaS, so a MaaS for everyone. And inclusivity when it comes to accessibility, physical accessibility, but also distance accessibility, I think is an important part of it. I think, and as a proof of that, I think that focus on the services, how should we provide these services in conjunction with transport, comes from this idea that not to focus only on the transportation side, but also about the services and to whom should we address these services. Sometimes, of course, I mean, in Japan, like everywhere in the world, many of these MaaS initiatives are driven by the private companies, private businesses, because in Japan, public transport is mostly private. In rural areas, it's mostly public, but there are some sources there. So the thing is that there are some business interests in that, and in business interests, it is true that sometimes some of these people may lay ahead, and some people actually may be behind. But in general, I think the idea to avoid that is to have these like consensus-based initiatives. So I think in general, this is a very important issue, and is being tackled in that way for rural areas mostly.
Bruno, anything?
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's the funny thing is that to relate that to an Australian context, in a remote Australian context, there's about 250 to 300 different types of population groups in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, with different languages as well. And when we talk about like different types of or cross-cultural element of mobility service provision, we talk about a service that has to sustain very different types of needs and profiles as well, and circumstances. And to design a service, like multiple services that can be supplied to different types of population group, it requires a mix between a good balance of, I suppose, tailored services, but also something that is very much low tech, easy to access, user-friendly, and that has a core characteristic in its very architecture of a service that is basically people-focused. And when this is embedded in the architecture of a service, there's a bit of a recipe for success. And the funny thing is that with the example of the Center Bush bus, it's a private business, and it has its benefits and its disadvantages as well. Because it's a private business, basically there's no incentive from the government to expand this business model. And the business owners are pretty happy with how they're running the service currently. They don't really want to expand because of basically finding the optimal, I guess, return on investment. And there would be some tremendous scope to expand the service and to support other businesses if there were some regulations at a market level.
Yeah.
In the Australian context, that's something that doesn't necessarily exist.
Yeah, government and guidance always comes into this, doesn't it? I'm just seeing Steve's point here in the chat about phone support being very important. I'm not trying to pick on Dwight here, but do go and look at his cafe that he did, because he's underselling what he does. Because the support that they've got there, the guaranteed ride system that they've got operating in his area to make sure that people are not stranded. And yes, I'm going into Jenny mode because this is my PhD and my passion. And these guys are all going to be my case studies internationally over the next couple of years as I go into the middle bit of my PhD. So you will hear more about these three countries for sure. But it is really important, and I think we've been touching this in the chat today and on Wednesday, that actually it's the approach you take to MaaS. And I know I'm preaching to some people that are very experienced in MaaS, and then at the other end there's going to be people that are going, what the hell, Jenny, are you talking about with mobility as a service? What does it mean? Nobody's given me a definition. Well, as Kate Pangborn is here as an academic, she'll agree there isn't one defined definition to MaaS as yet, but it has to be, and as we've seen, working together from that bottom-up perspective and that user perspective. And we've got all these challenges. And if you research MaaS, and if you haven't seen it, that diagram by Soccer of 0 being at the bottom and 4 being societal goals at the top, and Steve picked up on this. Actually, in a rural area, I would strongly argue that we flip that diagram and we start at the bottom with societal goals for the very reason that we're talking about. It's that accessibility, and we need to be able to make sure that our users can use what we offer and what they want, because it's about their needs. But I'm actually going to throw it back to the panel, because for me, rural MaaS actually picks up a lot on opportunity. And often we are discussing, oh, we don't have enough funding here to be able to do this, and rural areas are hit. Well, actually, we've got mobility gaps. And I think rural MaaS is showing where those mobility gaps are, and we can bring different organisations in and we can offer better services. So I really want to ask the panel what mobility gaps they've seen or they are seeing coming forward, and what's being used to plug those. And do users want those mobility gaps filled, or are we just filling them for the sake of filling them? So Bruno, over to you.
That's such a good question. It's almost a societal question, because when we speak about users, we speak about a very large group of very different types of people. At a society level, and to have the foundation of I guess, democratic transport system, you can define that by providing a universal form of service, or you can define that by providing the most efficient type of service. And there's a very wide spectrum between both ends. I would say, you know, in an ideal world, everyone would have access to state-of-the-art transport. We all know that that's not the case. The thing is that how we define social justice in a transport context, and how we define, you know, great opportunities for economic and social development, it is basically the key question here. For me, you know, looking at the potential that remote communities have in Australia, in an Australian context where it's highly inaccessible for many different reasons, you're looking at potentially, you know, upskilling a lot of people who are potentially able to provide those services locally. You're looking at capacity building. You're looking at you know, business models that are very much community-based, and that's something that you know, I think the grassroots thinking around that has a lot of values that is not necessarily very well captured by policy frameworks. And I would say that that's something that has consistently worked very well. And for example, the Centre Bush Bus is very much a community business. It's developed by members of the community for people from the community.
Steve, I see you're sitting there contemplating, but you do agree with this societal perspective, and being somebody that's been in this for a very long time, what are your thoughts?
Well, 100%, yeah, and I think this, honestly, I'm not just saying it because you're here and you can hear this community readiness idea, and, you know, increasing community capacity, it's got to be, and I like your idea of putting that at the top. And I think for me, yeah, community, people, you know, been in transport for a long time, not as long as Laurie, but used to work with Laurie and learned a lot from him.
He's gone.
Oh, he's gone. Oh,
He's gone.
He's gone to have his haircut, maybe. I think the one thing that I've learned is that, yeah, it's not about the transport. You know, it isn't. It's about the problems that people perceive around transport and knowledge, etc. And on Enable, one of the more interesting things that came out, just in terms of very specific needs, was spending 3 days at the urology department of Perth Royal Infirmary Hospital talking to people. The big last mile isn't the last mile. It's not about transport. It's about how you get from the bus stop or the car park to the urology department, to the check-in, which is about 500 meters, and it's up and down and round and about, and it kills people. And so having some, they get lost, it upsets them, they're not ready for it. And so building that into the information which they can get, which becomes part of MaaS. I mean, I'm not bothered what it's called, but part of a service that helps them travel will be key, and that's on our roadmap.
Azrael, Dwight, anything?
Sure. For the rural areas, the #1 problem we have is lack of supply of drivers from rural to urban, especially to work trips. So that means from carpooling or volunteer driver programs. We're spending a lot of time in working how we can really address it, and frankly try to apply some lessons from BlaBlaCar.
Okay, yeah.
So for the case of Japan regarding gaps, most of the transport operators, which again they are private, they are mostly focusing on these MaaS as not only as a solution for the incoming and ongoing problems in the rural areas such as aging population and so on, but also as a way to promote their own business. I mean, as a way to enhance and to adapt their business to the new generation. I think that also we need to agree that MaaS is somehow a buzzword, and the thing is that this is nothing necessarily bad or good. It all depends how they use it. But in Japan, I've seen that, for example, many initiatives that were actually, they has been historically done or done in a different way, they just were rebranded as MaaS, and that's not something good or bad. But when we think about what can drive in rural areas this new MaaS revolution, these new technologies, we are seeing that many of these solutions, such as, for example, integrating some touristic offers into a single bundle and sell them through an app, can actually serve as a financial support to the local community, not only by providing, of course, employment for the needs for the incoming tourists or whatever reason, but also as a funding for the railway companies or for the transport companies, which in turn they are keeping their operations there. So this is something, I think this is an interesting business opportunity, which is good for the community and is good for everyone that MaaS can actually drive on. And for the other cases we are seeing is that, for example, for on-demand mobility, we see on-demand mobility as a most cost-efficient solution to, for example, fixed line bus networks in certain places. And I think this is another important thing we need to see. So where MaaS can actually drive a more efficient network, so basically it's less money to spend from the public authority, and when can actually provide new sources of revenues that can actually support the local authority developments, I think. So this is a very Japanese way to see the things in this mobility environment.
Yep. I have to say we have to draw to a close, but I think if you were sitting here, and Ali might correct me if I'm wrong, talking about MaaS in general rather than narrowing it down to a rural suburban area, that actually we'd be talking about particular services and the public transport units and the actual services that are there. Whereas what we're talking about really is economic development. We're talking about the social side of things. We're talking about the communities and that bottom-up approach. And I know we haven't touched on it, but Bruno alluded to it earlier, but freight and parcels and goods are really an important part, and even maybe more so for the rural MaaS perspective, when you start talking about how do you make things financially viable, maximizing assets that are already on the road. And so the role, I think, personally, in rural suburban areas is very different, as Dwight has exampled many a times, to maybe a more Parisian example, or London, or whichever city you want to take. Would you agree with that, Ali?
Yeah, I was just going to say, even if I did think you were wrong, I still wouldn't correct you. But in this case, it happens that I absolutely do agree with pretty much everything that you said there. Absolutely.
I'm not that scary, but I do want to say thank you very much to our panelists. You will get probably bored of me bringing these guys in over the next couple of years, and Kate will be kicking my butt, and that's a very academic phrase, not to make sure that I do write these things and get them documented in the academic world. So me and rural maths ain't going anywhere, and neither are these gentlemen. They're going to be stuck in rural maths for the next few years. So thank you very much, gentlemen. And yes, Kate's not my supervisor. She's making that point very clear, but she's a very good friend. Anyway, Kate asked earlier on, what happened to all the pictures? Well, there you go. This is what SRITC means to people, okay? They've taken their pictures, and I will be sharing these later on, don't worry. I'll go back, wrong way. I have here, and Carla, mine's on the bottom left there. Carla and those that know me will be very impressed. I'm Gin Jen is what I'm often called, okay? And I've managed to get my ice tray in, my tonic in, and my crossbill gin from the Highlands of Scotland. So I think I did pretty well with SRITC and my gin. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break just now. If you still not shared your photograph, please do, because it's great to see this. We'll take a quick break. I'll be back at 11:52-ish, 5 minutes, and we're going to go into the workshops. Now, if you are going to leave us, please do put in the chat your top 3 priorities for what you'd love to see in a rural mobility strategy. As I mentioned, Laurie has had to go off to a different meeting, but the Smarter project has done some amazing work in actually analysing across Europe what the context is for rural mobility strategies, and there is only one country that has one at the moment in Europe. So I'll leave you with that thought. Go to the toilet, grab some more bits and pieces that you can think of for SRITC, and I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody.